Welcome back to Unjust Crimes. My name is Michelle, and this is part 3 of the unsolved murders of Barry and Honey Sherman. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, I do recommend going back and doing that. All of the court battles near the time of the murders certainly add another layer to this already very complicated case. On the very day of the murders, Barry had directed legal action against a former business partner and convicted fraudster. Just a week before the murders, he had won a long legal battle against his estranged cousins, the Winter Boys. Also around the same time, Apotex had lost a lawsuit and was facing a $580 million judgment. Now, Toronto police have said that the motive was financial and that they believe the targets were both Honey and Barry. But who died first? Forensically, they can't say, because it's impossible to answer that question. Because the killings were only 30 minutes apart, then the bodies were not found for 36 hours, and during that time, they sat in a warm, humid swimming pool room. And 36 hours is just simply too long to make a proper determination on when the killings happened so close together in time. Investigators have been tight-lipped as they quietly continue their investigation, which has now, reportedly, extended internationally, churning through information from 5 different countries. Whatever that means, I do not know. It wouldn't come out until the documents were unsealed in court that police had narrowed the time of death down from 8 p.m. to about 9:30 p.m. that Wednesday evening, December 13th. The police have never said how they know this. Now, the private investigative team also do believe that the Shermans were in fact killed on December 13th. They say this in part because Honey was wearing the same clothes that she was last seen in earlier that evening. So I just want to go over some things that those who were close to the Shermans were saying to police in those early weeks. In his interview with police, Jonathan said that his parents didn't have any mental health issues. Though they had not slept together in the same room for 10 years, he had no concerns about infidelity and he did not think his parents would ever get divorced. He detailed how to the public they appeared to be a power couple, but behind closed doors, they did not get along very well. He also described his father as, quote, brilliant, but lacking in emotional and social intelligence, whereas his mother was, quote, smart, abrasive, and high energy. He also told the police how in recent years that he had tried himself to distance himself from family business. Lauren, the eldest daughter, told police that she talked to her father every day, and that she had fought a lot with her parents in the past, but things had improved in recent years. She also said that they were, quote, a good family, even though she did not realize that when she was a child because she fought with them a lot. According to Lauren, one source of tension related to the lack of interest that her and her brother had in the family business. She told police that her father had always wanted her and her brother Jonathan to take over Apotex. She said her parents used to argue a lot while the kids were growing up, that they were the screaming and swearing type, but that they never got physical. And she went on to say that her parents were getting along better and were even seen in the past 5 years walking around holding hands. She went on to say that her parents were, quote, pillars of the community and really lovable people. And the idea that her parents committed suicide was ridiculous as they were a very wealthy family. Whatever that has to do with anything, I don't know. She described her mother as, quote, charitable, gregarious, and someone who made friends with everyone and never had a beef with anyone. She said her father was, quote, likable, but not social. He liked solving problems, and he got a PhD in rocket science from MIT at 24 years old. He liked making friends and working in pharmaceuticals. Now, Kaylin, the youngest child, in her interview talked about how her parents would never do anything to harm each other, nor would they have killed themselves. She does, however, tell police that as a child, she did not think her parents were close or in love. She said her mother was often upset that Barry was always working late, but in recent years her parents were becoming closer. Police also interviewed Kaylin's fiancé, Jared Render, and he told police that Barry was very generous, as he was paying for the entire wedding. He said Barry had helped him get a job as an electrician at Apotex, and that he also helped Honey out with home technical issues. He also said that the Sherman family begged Barry to install security cameras in the house, but that Barry was never afraid of anything. He told police that he was aware the bodies were found near the swimming pool, but to his knowledge, Barry and Honey never went down there and that the pool was green. Police also interviewed Alexandra and her then-husband Brad Krawczyk. She told police that, quote, Apotex was Barry's life. He was always there and he loved all his employees. She says her father was smarter than anyone and her mother was a strong personality, loud, outgoing, and loving. Like her sisters, she noted that her parents' relationship was difficult while she was growing up, with her father always at work and her mother parenting. She says that with the birth of the grandchildren, though, her parents seemed to be more in love and not arguing and were caring towards their grandchildren. She told police that she would, quote, always joke that her father was autistic because he was so brilliant but could not interact with people socially or read people, and people would take advantage of him. She detailed her plans with Barry and Honey to have that Hanukkah dinner, the one that didn't happen, and she said that her last contact with her mother was an email at 8:16 p.m. on the Tuesday, December 12th. Her husband, Brad Krawcheck, who worked for SureFam, told police that, quote, Barry seemed quiet lately, but not sad, despite losing a total of about $1 billion in lawsuits in the last 3 months. He said that Barry was maintaining that he was not going to pay them and that they were financially stable. Everyone was told everything was fine. Honey's sister Mary Shetman told police that she thought the murders were because of religion. In the 6 months before the murders, Honey had gone to a lecture, quote, about stopping money from getting into Muslim fundamentalists' hands. She believed, quote, Barry was providing funding for this, and that Honey was very vocal about being Jewish. She said the Shermans had wildly different parenting styles. Honey was the mean one, who was tough on the kids, wanting them to work hard. Meanwhile, Barry lavished the children with money, beginning with $1 million when each turned 21, and much more money to the 2 older children, Lauren and Jonathan, in later years. And Mary had given the police the first inkling that they would have of the spiderweb of financial dealings that they had to unravel. The billionaire founder of Apotex was involved in so much more than pharmaceutical generic drugs. Mary told them of a recent dealing that Barry had that had gone sideways, and that was with a young man named Andrew Liss, who was the former boyfriend of Jonathan. That prompted the police to reach out to Andrew and get his side of the story. So in his interview, he told police that several years before, he and his then-boyfriend Jonathan had approached Barry with some business ideas. Barry liked one, and a deal was struck where Barry provided $50 million for Andrew to build and sell homes. The caveat, according to Andrew, was that Jonathan could not be involved because Barry wanted Jonathan to work at Apotex. Anyway, the deal came crashing down in August of 2016 when, as it turned out, Andrew knew nothing about building and selling homes, and Barry had to step in and sell 2 homes that were being worked on by Andrew. Quote, I lost millions, Barry told him. And for the next year, Barry had paid Andrew a monthly stipend, but those payments had ended in July of 2017. Now, Andrew and Jonathan had long since broken up, and Andrew told police that he had felt betrayed by the way he was treated by Barry, having thought of Barry as a mentor and the Shermans as his family. Honey, he told police, though, never liked him, and he said that Honey had thought, quote, he made Jonathan gay. Now, that story of a Barry Sherman deal going sideways is not unique. Just a few things to know about what was happening in the Shermans' life prior to their murders. At home, things actually seemed to be going pretty good, but in other areas, Barry was involved in dozens of heated lawsuits that I've already gone over. There was the one with his cousins, there was the one that Apotex was facing for the $580 million judgment, and apparently he had lost a few other lawsuits too, and he was actually facing having to pay $1 billion. Now, some people that were close to Barry were saying that he wasn't worried and he had no intention of paying any of that money, while others that were close to him were saying that he was somewhat worried and was trying to come up with money. As you see, Barry was a multi-billionaire, but he didn't allegedly have that kind of liquid cash just kicking around because most of his money was tied up in various investments. Now, it's possible that none of that has anything to do with the murders, but I think it's important to understand the full story as best as we can anyways. And then you have the whole drama with the Teva Pharmaceuticals that was suing Apotex because of Jeremy Desai and his alleged relationship with one of Teva's employees who allegedly gave them trade secrets. And Jack Kay said, quote, that he believed that for the good of the company, Jeremy should have been let go. And that was the only time in their 3 decades together that he disagreed with Barry. Now, Alex Glassenberg, the senior officer at SureFam, also told police that he thought Jeremy Desai should be let go. However, Jeremy Desai had Barry Sherman's backing. In the weeks leading up to December 2017, not only did Apotex lose several lawsuits, it had just laid off numerous staff, and apparently, allegedly, more cuts were coming. And while this information piqued the interest of investigators, Jack Kay told investigators that it likely had nothing to do with the couple's murders because according to him, quote, Barry would not be fazed by Apotex's financial situation, as Apotex was only one part of Sherman Holdings and they have other money. So it was about a year after the crimes that the Sherman lawyer Brian Greenspan held a press conference where he said that the police had failed to properly examine the crime scene. He pointed out that his team had discovered a problem with one of the locks at the Sherman home. The police had missed that, along with the fact that the side door to the Sherman home was unlocked and a window was open in the basement. He said that police did not collect all the fingerprints and potential DNA from the scene to compare to those fingerprints and bodily fluids with those from everyone known to have been present at the scene at the time approximate to the crime. And this collection of prints and fluids is conducted for the simple purpose of elimination. Whose fingerprints do we recognize? Which might have been left by an intruder? He also said, Greenspan, that the police had missed at least 25 palm or fingerprint impressions that were discovered by his private team at the scene. Once the house was turned over to them, after more than 6 weeks of police presence, Greenspan and his private investigators also discovered that the police forensics team didn't even vacuum the pool deck floor to pick up any microscopic evidence that the killer might have left behind. And his team had turned over 2 vacuum bags of fine particles, plus the finger and palm print impressions, to the police. Whether that was of any value, police have not said. At the press conference, Greenspan said the most perplexing and upsetting aspect of the investigation was the failure to recognize the obvious, that the bodies of Barry and Honey were staged post-mortem in a very deliberate manner. That's when he announced that the family was offering a $10 million reward and that the private investigation was setting up a tip line. Just of note here, in relation to the police collecting fingerprints of those that were known to have been in the house around the time of the murders, well, the Sherman's personal trainer told the Toronto Star that her fingerprints and DNA was not collected until 9 months after the murders. And this elimination fingerprinting, that's homicide 101. You need to get in there and you need to find out what fingerprints, should be there and what ones have no reason to be there. And whatever ones that are not supposed to be there, hopefully it leads you to a suspect. Why this was not done, I have no explanation. Now, at the time of this press conference, the police did come and hit back at this private investigation and Brian Greenspan, saying that he had no right to do that because releasing details of the crime scene could hurt the investigation. Now, I tend to agree with the police here because there were details of that crime scene that only the killers would know. Up to that point, only the police, the private investigators, and the perpetrator or perpetrators knew how the bodies were posed. The police also acknowledged that the killer or killers were probably watching these press conferences. Neighborhood canvasses had occurred in the area surrounding Sherman's home, and police collected 4 terabytes of security video from both commercial and residential properties. On the footage from the house across the street, on Thursday morning, December 14th, around 9:30 in the morning, somebody, a man, comes to the Sherman home. He got out of his car and went to the front door. Now, it's believed from what people that have seen this video, what they can see, it looks like this person went inside the house, though no one can confirm this. Anyway, then the person went back to his car, then back to the front door, and back to his car 3 times. In total, he was in the area of the Sherman home for about 29 minutes. And it's really eerie because, the Shermans were already dead inside their home. Now, who is this person? How did he get in, if he did indeed get in? And what did he do? Now, police have said that they do know who this person is, but that's all they said. They have not said who the person was or why they were there, and obviously they're not very interested in why that person was there. The police were looking at financial motives in this investigation. So they looked at Barry's banking records at the Bank of Montreal to see if he was in any financial hardships and to try and narrow down the time of death and track the movements of Barry in the days leading up to his death. And they were trying to identify persons with whom he had recent financial transactions with who may be witnesses or potential suspects. They also looked at his bank records post-mortem, which they thought could reveal, quote, if any persons had access to his accounts, which could reveal a motive for murder as well as identify any potential suspects. Police were also looking at these banking and credit card records to see if anything that was used in the murders could have been purchased by the Shermans. For instance, the belt that was used around Barry's neck. We know that Honey had bought those 2 belts at Canadian Tire for $9.99, but months before. We do not know, the police probably do know, but I do not know, where the belt that was around Honey's neck came from. Now, what, if anything, police found in the banking records remains sealed. The private investigators believe that the billionaire couple were murdered by multiple killers. They also believe that Honey had struggled with her killer or killers because she had cuts on her lip and her nose, and she was sitting in a pool of her own blood when she was discovered. However, there was comparatively low blood apparent on her upper body clothing, suggesting that she had been face down on the tile bleeding for some time before being bound to the handrail in an upright position. In 2019, the Toronto Police announced that this case was active and ongoing, and that they continued to urge the public to come forward with any information. The police held a press conference in 2019 where Police Homicide Inspector Hank Insignia told reporters that the case was now being solely handled by his detectives, which were led by Detective Sergeant Brandon Price, with assistance from Detective Dennis Yim and Detective Christy Devine. Detective Gomes, who was the original lead detective, had moved on to another department by this time. And they said that police had been getting a lot of information from a lot of different sources. He said the family had received more than 300 tips from the public and forwarded them to the police. By April 25th of 2019, the Toronto Police said that they had a working theory of the case and a, quote, idea of what happened. What that is, though, I have no idea. By the end of 2019, the private investigation into the murders of Barry and Honey Sherman was over, and they handed everything over to the police. And it is also believed that this is around the same time that Alexandra went to the police with her theory that her brother Jonathan was involved in the murder of their parents. In 2020, the judge presiding over the investigation released a single surveillance photo out of dozens still sealed. The picture was taken at 4:45 p.m. the day of the murders at Apotex, and the photo shows the three architects the Shermans were meeting to go over plans for their new house. Photos of the Shermans themselves that were taken at Apotex that day remain sealed because police say they do not want the clothing that they were wearing revealed to the public, believing that it could harm their investigation. Now, I have to say here, though, that I did hear in the podcast by the Toronto Star, or the documentary, I can't remember which, maybe both, there were some descriptions of their clothing, but I'm not going to go over that here, just in case. Now, by this time, the police did have the full files from the private investigative team, and Detective Yim said the police were trying to determine, quote, the fullness and completeness of the information. They were trying to match the private detective's information with information they already had, and to date, I have not heard anything more on this. Now, during one of his court appearances with the Toronto Star, Detective Yim told the court that 4 months into the investigation of the murders, homicide detectives noticed the start of a pattern. In the quantity of information they amassed, and the further they've gone in the case, Yim said a pattern emerged. What that pattern is, he would not say. In November of 2020, police confirmed the existence of a single person of interest in the Sherman case to numerous media outlets, which reported that Constable Alex Lee told them, quote, the Toronto Police Services can confirm that a person of interest has been identified but not arrested. Police say that they would not publicly identify the individual, both because that could hurt their investigation and, if they were wrong, it would prejudice the interests of an innocent person. Quote, it could compromise the investigation if the perpetrator knew they were identified. It could precipitate flight, they could take steps to get rid of evidence, frustrate our investigation, said Homicide Detective Dennis Yim. A couple of days later, Detective Sergeant Brandon Price issued a statement to clarify that police had numerous persons of interest. Now, did Detective Sergeant Brandon Price walk back those comments to not frighten their suspect? Or was it really a slip-up to begin with to say that they only had one suspect? I do not know. Now, the unsealed documents in this case show that police have done an international search warrant that was executed somewhere in the world, and a search warrant in the province of Ontario sometime in 2020. And by 2020, the investigation was said to be relying heavily on data analysis, and Detective Yim, while in court with the Toronto Star, said that they were using this data analysis to try and prove what he called the theory of the case. The unsealed documents also revealed that 8 days after their bodies were discovered, their son Jonathan had told investigators during an interview that the couple had enemies. He said his parents were, quote, complicated people, and that there were people out there who would have a grudge against them and would have a reason to hurt them. But the documents are redacted, and who those individuals are, we do not know. Of note about these unsealed documents is that Justice Pringle has kept many pages of detailed information of the crime scene sealed because the police say that it is sensitive information that only a few people would know. In other words, someone who was there. In other words, the killers. Then what must have seemed like a break, and I guess it was a break in the case, came on December 14th, 2021, when police released a short video of what they called the Walking Man video. It's a short video picked up on a camera close to the Sherman house that shows a person walking on a sidewalk near the Sherman's Toronto home on December 13th, 2017. Of all the people seen on video footage seized from nearby security cameras that night, this person is the only person that detectives have been unable to identify and exclude from the investigation. Detective Sergeant Brandon Price said, quote, "We have been able to eliminate the vast majority of people captured on the video. We are left with one individual whom we have been unable to identify." Price said police are suspicious of the person's activities because they walk into a, quote, "defined area, not captured by video surveillance, stay there for a while, and then leave. Through our investigation, we have been unable to determine what this individual's purpose was in the neighborhood. The timing of this individual's appearance is in line with when we believe the murders took place. Based on this evidence, we are classifying this individual as a suspect. Detective Price said that video analysis showed that the individual was between 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 9 inches tall, but that the person's sex, race, and other identifiers could not be determined. The video showed the person walking with an unusual gait where they kick up their right foot with every step. Detective Price encouraged anyone who may recognize the person or the person themselves to come forward and said that he hasn't ruled out that this person had a legitimate reason to be in the area at the time. To my knowledge, we still do not know who this was in the Walking Man video. In this press conference, Detective Price said that police had conducted approximately 250 witness interviews, received over 1,000 tips from the public, and taken 992 investigative actions as part of their investigation. Quote, "We have remained steadfast in our commitment to bring closure to the Sherman family, their friends, loved ones, and the community." So here's the thing with this video of the Walking Man. Police had this video since the early days of the investigation, but only put it out to the public 4 years after the murders. But now Detective Price did address this, why it took so long for them to put out the video, saying that it had, quote, "been with us from the early stages of the investigation. It took some time to collect all of this footage. It took some time to analyze the footage, to be able to link those images together and identify that this individual's timeline was consistent when we believe these offenses took place. And, reportedly, due to the location of the cameras at surrounding homes, police cannot be sure that this person actually went inside the house, but they do believe that he did. Since then, police have received hundreds of tips related to that video, and they also said that their investigation had moved on to a new phase after their efforts to nab a suspect based on phone mobility was exhausted. Court documents released in January 2022 indicate that from interviews, several people had been implicated, but none had been elevated to the status of prime suspect by detectives. By April of 2022, the police said the case was unfortunately old, still in the investigation phase, and no charges have been filed against anyone, but that the investigation was still active and ongoing. Unsealed documents show that police did execute a new search warrant that was served at an undisclosed location on December 21st, 2022, and this search warrant had unearthed 14,801 electronic files that police had not seen yet. Now, information on where these files came from or details of the contents of those files remain sealed. In the warrant papers, police say they are seeking, quote, "documents and data that would further implicate or exonerate current persons of interest in this investigation and determine if any persons had or did not have a motive to kill Bernard and Honey Sherman." By December 8th of 2022, as the 5th anniversary of her parents' murders approached, Alexandra put out a statement, in part saying that there had been no justice for her parents and no closure for me and my family. She reiterated that the $10 million reward still stood for any information, and a couple of days later, Jonathan added $25 million to the reward money, which increased the overall reward money to $35 million. Let's not forget that the police's hands have been tied to a certain degree because members of the Sherman family, lawyers, and executors of the Sherman estate have determined what police can and cannot see. Again, I have to wonder how much this hindered the case. According to an investigator with knowledge of the case, quote, "It's absolutely ridiculous. How on earth can this be solved without knowing absolutely everything?" I have to agree. Those in charge of Barry's files have picked and chosen what to hand over. For example, in the beginning of the investigation, they freely gave the files relating to Curie Winter and Frank D'Angelo to the police, and they pointed them out as suspects. But on the other hand, other files related to Barry's offshore trusts and certain mega deals were not handed over so freely. Given that police say in their search warrant documents that there is a financial motive, Barry's holdings are probably key to the investigation, but figuring out just what Barry had, now and in the past, proved to be a big problem. Now, Sherman sources say that Barry used his money in the Bahamas to pay executive bonuses, to fund real estate deals, and invest in new companies. But it's unclear if taxes were ever paid on what amounts to, some sources say, $2 billion in funds that have been sheltered away in tax havens. To this day, police do not have the full picture of Barry Sherman's $10 billion empire. Wow, that's just wow. Makes you wonder what they are afraid of. What could possibly be in those documents that police shouldn't see? Did they really think that the police were going to share their confidential pharmaceutical trade secrets? I don't think so. I think there's something fishy somewhere that they don't want the police to see. Now, I'm not saying that's related to the murders, but maybe something that could land them in some hot water. Something like tax evasion, maybe? Albeit, isn't solving the murders more important? So where is the case now? Well, the case, according to the Toronto police, is very much, quote, active and ongoing. Reportedly, Detective Yim is involved in what police say is a circumstantial case, meaning that there is no direct forensic or other evidence pointing to the identity of the killers. The one lone full-time detective, Detective Yim, spends his days sifting through thousands of business records, financial transactions, and so on, trying to find that one needle in this haystack. Toronto police have said the motive was financial, and they believe the murders were a targeted double homicide. They have said that Barry's estate is embedded in their investigation. Police have also said details of the estate of Barry and Honey Sherman, who was left money and who was not, is embedded in their probe, but refused to answer additional questions on any of these issues. They have said that they have a theory and an idea of what happened. And there are still a lot of documents related to this case that are sealed, and much of what remains sealed deals with the police's theories of the case and the tracking of that walking man. Now, the Toronto Star reported that police think that Barry and Honey may have been under surveillance before their murders for about a month. Allegedly, police believe that the walking man is connected to people that were surveying the Shermans. And in their search warrant documents, police have said that nothing forensically learned at the crime scene has helped them with their investigation. There has been much speculation about who might have been responsible for the murders, particularly given Barry's many business associates, even some with criminal records, and those who have been angered by his actions. Barry himself acknowledged that an attempt could be made on his life. Quote, "For $1,000, paid to the right person, you can probably get someone killed. Perhaps I'm surprised that hasn't happened," he told Jeffrey Robertson in an interview for his book in the late 1990s. Authorities have so far offered no suspects and no motive for the suspected killings. Apparently, in this case, police have multiple persons of interest, but have not come across anything substantial enough to elevate one person to prime suspect. So I'm going to go through some possible suspects, keeping several things in mind. Number one, Barry had a lot of enemies in his business life, even in his personal life, and everybody wanted a piece of Barry's fortune. We do not know much about the police investigation, and I think that's important to keep in mind because there probably is a lot that we are not aware of. The one thing we do know about the investigation is that police have said that the estate of Barry Sherman is embedded in the investigation. Logically, then we are led to believe that either someone who was getting a lot of money, for example, his children, or someone who was getting nothing, for example, Aunt Mary and her children were involved. Or maybe even someone by extension who could be getting a lot of money, like a son-in-law. But I don't think the police would really put that out there, that plain and simple. So I think it's a lot more complicated than that. The one thing that we can be certain about is that Barry and Honey Sherman were most likely murdered for their money. Obviously not money that they had on them, I don't mean that, because Honey had $7,500 in her purse, and God knows how much jewelry and so on that someone could have taken. I mean big money. Big money like an inheritance worth billions, or a business deal worth billions. Or finding out that you are not going to get several million, or you lost millions because of Barry. This was no robbery. The Shermans were targeted and murdered for what we do not know yet, but it was not a robbery. Whoever did this intended to kill the Shermans that night. And much can be said about why that night. In the words of Kevin Donovan from the Toronto Star, that night and the days that followed were, in his words, the perfect storm. And I have to agree. All the people that would have noticed the Shermans' absence were not around. And that was no coincidence. I think whoever did this knew the couple's schedule, and I think that they somehow knew that Wednesday night was the perfect time. Nobody would notice them missing the following day, the Thursday, because first, nobody was scheduled to be at the Sherman house that day, and Honey had given her assistant that Thursday and Friday off. I also think Jack Kay being out of town is important because he was one person who would have definitely noticed Barry's absence, and he probably would have sounded the alarm, but Jack was in New York. And I think the fact that Jack was out of town was significant, just like I think it was significant that Honey's assistant had the day off. Now, the detectives had asked Honey's assistant how could someone access Honey's schedule and the schedule for appointments at Old Connolly Road. And according to her assistant, Honey didn't have a password on her phone or her iPads. She kept all of her scheduled events in her Google Calendar, which was linked to those devices, and that Honey liked her to print out her calendar appointments, and she kept them all clipped together with a big fat black clip on her desk next to the computer. I also think it's important that Mary, Honey's sister and best friend, was out of town in Florida, because she is also someone that would have noticed that Honey wasn't around, and she probably would have also sounded the alarm. I think the killers chose a time when all of the people that were close to the Shermans were away, like Kevin Donovan said, the perfect storm. I've also seen the theory floated around by Kevin Donovan of the Toronto Star that Barry was lured home that night using some kind of ruse. Now we know that Barry typically stayed at the office till 10 or 11, but that night he left at 8:30, and he had told the contractors that they were meeting that he had to go home early for some reason, but the contractors couldn't remember what that reason was. Friends have wondered if there was some significance to where Barry had parked that night. For instance, Frank D'Angelo wondered if somehow the killer had encouraged Barry to park underground. You see, some of his friends said that Barry was lazy and would park in the driveway next to Honey's Lexus so that he wouldn't have to take the stairs from the basement up to the main level of the house when he got home, while others said that he did use the underground parking. People have wondered if that night, if he was lured or encouraged to park in the underground parking, where the killer or killers could have more easily controlled him, and they would have seen him coming because they would have been able to see through that glass wall. The Shermans were found in the most remote part of the house, which suggests that this location was chosen in the hopes of prolonging their discovery as long as possible. Some people believe whoever killed the Shermans hired a hitman, while others think the crime was too personal. And they do say that strangulation is very personal. Either way, I think that what the private investigative team has said is true, that there were multiple killers. Because to me, it just seems like it's too much work for one person, especially if Honey was killed upstairs, so in other words, she was strangled and then dragged downstairs. Sure, the person would be spent by the time that Barry got home, which was only a half an hour later, and then to turn around and strangle Barry and pose both bodies. The only way I can see that is if Barry was told to sit where he was found, because I can't see one person being able to drag a roughly 200-pound man who was dead weight into position after death, and then stage Honey too. It just seems a bit much for one person, and after doing all of that to go around and make sure you left absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Also, there's no way that anyone in that house. And also, think about it. That was a lot to do for one person. Not only a lot to do, but how could anybody be certain that nobody was going to show up at the Shermans that night? For one person to do all of that and really take a big chance on not being caught, I think there was more than one person. Possibly even, I've seen that the Toronto Star suggested that maybe the walking man was a lookout. That's possible. The bodies were staged, and I do agree with the private investigative team who said that that was done to make it look like a murder-suicide, or double suicide to throw the cops off. I bet that whoever did that was hoping that the whole thing would be written off as such. End of story. Now, I've gone back and forth whether I think this was a hit or someone they knew who actually did the deed. I'm truly not sure. Strangulation is definitely personal, but that does not mean that the hitmen were not told how to do it. I guess for the right amount of money, someone could have arranged hitmen to strangle and stage the bodies. I still think that whoever did this was hoping that the whole thing was going to be written off as murder-suicide or double suicide. Problem solved. So I want to be very clear that when I say suspects, I am not talking about people the police have identified as such, because the police have not identified anybody. I'm talking about possible suspects that have come up in various news articles, podcasts, documentaries, and online forums as people who could have had the motive. I think it would be hard to argue that one person who had a motive to kill Barry and Honey was Kerry Winter. He was the one who spearheaded the lawsuit against Barry, and he's openly said how much he hates Barry, and he often fantasized about killing Barry. And no doubt he's a good suspect, but allegedly he has provided an alibi to police, and according to him, he's been cleared. Now, whether or not that's true, I do not know. Now, to add someone else into this Winter mix, Kerry had mentioned that he suspected that possibly his brother Jeffrey could have been involved. You see, Jeffrey had fallen on hard times. He was diagnosed as being bipolar, and he had not been able to work, and his marriage had broken up. Back in 2017, he was living like a hermit in his house in Toronto, but now he's living in a shelter. Now, he did actually do an interview and talked about his relationship with Barry and how Barry had helped him start several businesses. He didn't provide an alibi for the Wednesday night, but said that he had nothing to do with the murders. The other brother, Tim, who was the eldest of the brothers, had never really had much involvement with Barry. Another obvious contender for prime suspect is a pharmaceutical rival. Barry was hated by his rivals, and it is not out of the realm of possibility that one of them had enough and decided that Barry had to go. These people definitely had the money to hire a professional hitman. Those who work in the pharmaceutical industry, though, dismiss this notion, saying that we sue, we don't murder. But for many people, they think that this is why Barry is dead, that Big Pharma had rubbed him out, because for many people, Barry was seen as a hard-nosed, nasty businessman, the most litigious man in Canada. But the thing about the generic pharmaceutical business is that since the 1990s, you had to go to court if you wanted to try and defeat a brand-name drug patent. That's the law. And Apotex, being the biggest generic company in Canada, was by definition the most litigious. According to Barry, basically Apotex was a litigation firm that happened to sell pharmaceuticals. CBC spoke with an FBI profiler who said that as far as contract killers go, from a possible drug rival, well, he guessed it could be possible, because contract killers, they do try to throw you off, but in his personal opinion, in this case, it's not likely. And others have said even though brand-name drug companies hated Barry, there really would have been no point to having him killed because at the end of the day, the business still existed. Killing him didn't prove anything. Now, one pharmaceutical company who has been suggested as a suspect in killing the Shermans is Teva Pharmaceuticals. Now, to put the company size in perspective, Teva was Goliath. It's the biggest generic company in the world with 6 times the revenue of Apotex, who was like David, and both were fighting for market share behind the scenes, and there was a bit of nasty litigation. In the fall of 2017, there was that lawsuit from Teva against Apotex, the one where Teva accused Apotex's CEO, Jeremy Desai, of having trade secrets from a former Teva employee. So Apotex and Desai denied all these allegations, but according to Toronto police documents, other executives at Apotex wanted Barry to fire Jeremy Desai. They'd had enough of him. But Barry backed Jeremy Desai 120%, and his unwavering support had led to whispers in the pharma community that Barry was actually the quarterback of a plan to steal Teva information. And when Barry was killed, those whispers intensified, that maybe Teva was responsible. Sure, Teva didn't like Barry or Apotex, and both companies were in financial difficulty at the time, but Teva had at least 8 other generic companies it was battling for market share with, all who were much bigger than Apotex, and their founders and CEOs were never killed. Now, one strange thing did happen in relation to Jeremy Desai. Now, does that mean anything, or is it just a coincidence? I have no clue. But Jeremy Desai, the CEO of Apotex, resigned just hours ahead of the police news conference where the police announced the deaths were now considered double-targeted murders. According to Apotex, this was because Jeremy Desai wanted to pursue other opportunities, and there was no indication that the resignation was in any way linked to the news conference. But certainly that timing did raise eyebrows. Another person of interest is Frank D'Angelo, Barry's friend and business partner, and a lot of Barry's family and friends pointed their finger at Frank. But Barry and Frank were legitimate friends. Moreover, when Barry died, the Sherman children cut Frank off, and he lost all of his businesses. So I don't think it really makes sense for him to have killed the person that was bankrolling him. Now, is there stuff that the family and friends know that we do not know? Absolutely. So you never know. I did actually see that allegedly, just before the murders, Barry was telling Frank, who he had supported for so many years, that he might have to close his businesses down if the bottom line didn't approve. Now that could be seen as motive. But according to Frank, he has provided an alibi for the night that Barry and Honey were murdered, and he was not involved. So we know that Barry's estate is allegedly embedded in this investigation. Who got money and who did not? Does that mean that his children are suspects, since they were the sole beneficiaries of Barry's will? Does that make other extended family members like Mary and her family suspects because they didn't get what they expected? What about other family members? For instance, Barry's sister, who was supposedly to be listed as a beneficiary of one of his trusts. What about her kids and grandkids, who are also supposedly named as beneficiaries in this trust? Let me be clear that this trust was supposedly a separate trust that Barry had set up in 2016 to support not only his children, but his sister and Honey's sister Mary and their kids. But as far as I know, since the Shermans' deaths, none of these people have gotten anything from this trust. Okay, so that being said, could Barry and Honey's kids be considered suspects? Maybe. Have the police cleared them? I don't think so. Police have publicly said that they haven't cleared anybody, and I did hear in one of the podcast episodes from the Toronto Star that they would have expected to hear by now if the kids were cleared, and they have not. Now, does that mean anything? I'm not sure. I do know that out of anyone, the Sherman kids stood to gain the most, but would they really go so far as to kill their parents to get it? Because they were going to get it anyways. Now, I have seen that Jonathan has acted suspicious, and I think that's hard to argue with. He certainly did make a big play to take control of his father's empire, and he seems to be making a point of cutting out everyone that Barry had the utmost trust in, from Jack Cade to Alex Glassenberg to Frank D'Angelo. Allegedly, or reportedly, his sister Alexandra has named Jonathan as a suspect. Aside from feeling like Jonathan was a power-hungry and money-hungry monster, something happened at Jonathan's cottage about a year after the murders that convinced Alexandra that Jonathan had had a hand in their parents' deaths. I wish I knew what that was. Allegedly, the other two sisters, Lauren and Kaylin, have sided with Alexandra. That's harsh. But I do have to say, Jonathan did do a lot of very questionable things that make you go, So just a little backstory again. We know that Barry was facing that $580 million judgment that he thought he would have to pay in January of 2018. Barry was trying to gather the money, and to do this, part of that was he asked his son and his business partner to put mortgages on their storage company. Now, as I've mentioned before, Jonathan did do an extensive interview with the Toronto Star. During that interview, he gave a detailed account of his whereabouts the day of the murders, and supposedly he supplied this photo of his own hand with some cryptocurrency codes on it that were taken timestamped 7:17 p.m., December 13th, 2017, and the location was visible as his house. Now, he says he took the picture to have a record of a seed code for his cryptocurrency account. How do we know that he wasn't just trying to create an alibi for himself? Don't get me wrong, I'm not implying that he is lying or that he was involved in the murders, but just because you say something doesn't make it true. And again, I think that Jonathan did do some things that did raise a lot of suspicions in light of his parents' murders. It's put to him in his interview that even if that picture is of your hand, you still had time to drive to your parents' place, which was only 45 minutes away. To which Jonathan replied that he's always assumed, quote, that whoever killed his parents hired someone else. Now, before this interview, Jonathan had forwarded emails between himself and Barry for Kevin Donovan to see. Jonathan said that was all of the emails, but allegedly a source has come forward after this interview with a chain of emails dated October 27, 2017, which was just 6 weeks before the murders and just a couple of weeks before Barry's stern request that Jonathan and Adam pay back the $50 to $60 million. The topic in these emails is a planned meeting between Barry and Jonathan to discuss the Sherman family fortunes. Barry says that Jack Kay will be present, and Jonathan wants to bring his own partner, Adam Pollan. But Barry doesn't want Adam there, and tells Jonathan, I want to meet with you. I don't want to meet with you and Adam. You are my son. Jonathan makes a point of pointing out to Barry that he is the heir apparent, and everything he does centers around building a safe and stable financial basis for future generations of Shermans. To which Barry replies, that's what I have been doing for 50 years with considerable degree of success despite great obstacles. In another chain of emails from 2015, Jonathan, remember, was talking to Barry about Frank D'Angelo and how he couldn't understand why Barry continuously funded Frank. And here you have Barry's own son, Jonathan, with all this business education and experience, and he couldn't get the money that he was asking for. Jonathan was outraged and could not understand this. Also in these emails, Jonathan approached Barry about succession plans, and whether or not he and Adam could play a role in that. As far as I know, Barry never responded to Jonathan's inquiry about Adam Pollen having a role in succession, though sources say that Barry was no fan of Adam Pollen. But in response to Frank D'Angelo, Barry sent Jonathan the trailer to Frank's latest movie. But what does any of that have to do with the murders, you may be wondering? Well, probably nothing, but I just wanted to show that long before Barry was murdered, it seems like Jonathan was angling to take over control. And as I mentioned, after these emails, Jonathan even went so far as to tell his sisters that he didn't think their father was competent enough to be running the business. And one of the girls actually told Barry this, and he made a comment to Jack Kay, something along the lines of, "There goes Jonathan trying to take over," something like that. Then there were all the things that Jonathan did actually do to try and get control of Barry's businesses, mainly Apotex and Surefam after Barry and Honey were murdered. The firing of Jack Kay, how he has tried to have Alex Glassenberg removed, how he has suggested that he control his sister's money, how he has suggested that Alexandra is not capable of handling the charity businesses. Now, it may all be nothing more than a big power trip, but it also could be seen as suspicious. One thing about Jonathan, allegedly he and Honey hated each other. If Barry had died and Honey had lived, Honey would have had control over the money, and she was not as generous as Barry was with the kids. As for the other Sherman children, I do not know enough about any of them to put together anything that suggests they could or could not be suspects. They had as much to gain from their parents' deaths as Jonathan. Now apparently Jonathan has named 3 people that he believes could have been involved in the murders. One, as I mentioned, was Frank D'Angelo. Another person that Jonathan had mentioned was Jack Kay. And I do not know who the third person is, but reportedly it is a person who is involved in Barry's business life and someone that Barry had the utmost confidence in. Now Jonathan's alleged theory is that these 3 men wanted more money from Barry than they were getting, so they conspired to kill him. Now, reportedly Jonathan has no proof of this, and both Frank and Jack Kay left this whole idea off, but reportedly the third person wasn't too pleased. Now, as I've mentioned, Frank lost all his businesses after Barry died, Jack Kay was fired and had to threaten a lawsuit to get paid out, and the third person, apparently, nothing has changed for them. As to the suspicions of his sister and others, Jonathan says it means nothing to him. Quote, "I'm the only person who knows that I didn't do it." Now, there was another person that was brought up early in the case in relation to the murders, and that was Sean Rutenberg. And the reason why is because Barry had invested in a business created by Sean Rutenberg, who was a convicted fraudster who had served prison time alongside an old friend of Barry's, Myron Gottlieb. Now, Myron and his wife were longtime friends of the Shermans, and Myron had been convicted of fraud in the LiveNet entertainment financial fraud scandal. Now, Sean Rutenberg and Myron Gottlieb pitched Barry a concept called Trivia for Good, which was a smartphone app that claimed it would generate revenue by pushing advertisements on the user. Unbeknownst to Barry, there never was an app. And meanwhile, Rutenberg was also scamming women in what is known as romance fraud. And in the weeks before the murders, Barry went after Sean Rutenberg. He gave his friend Myron a pass, but he brought the full force of his litigation team down on Sean Rutenberg. The morning of the day that he was murdered, Barry had his lawyers file new documents against this con artist. And it was early in this investigation that a lot of media suspected that Rutenberg might have had something to do with the murders, kill Barry in retaliation. And in the case of Barry Sherman, the list of business associates he had negative relations with is so high. It is possible that Barry had screwed someone over through the years, or cost someone millions, or cost someone their company. The list just goes on. Now, I will say that these murders felt targeted at Barry and Honey, so in my opinion, I don't think a business associate or rival would target Honey. I think if it was a business associate or rival, they probably would have just shot Barry in the head as he left the office late one night. Conspiracy theories in this case have run rampant, everything from COVID-19 to the Clintons to the Russians to organizations in Israel to Justin Trudeau to the Hells Angels, and then there are others who think that the target was Honey because she was the only one who had any signs of violence on her face. But really, as far as theories go, the main ones are that the couple was killed for money or for retaliation for something. In relation to money, I would say theories suggest the couple was killed for their estate, with many people believing one of the children or someone close to the children who stood to gain tremendously had the Shermans killed. I guess you could argue here that those close to the Shermans, like Mary's family, for example, could have had the Shermans killed if they had found out that they were not in the will. Also in relation to money, I guess it is possible that Barry had screwed someone out of a lot of money, like a pharmaceutical rival or even another business associate. For instance, Jonathan's ex-boyfriend Andrew List, who had a business building and selling homes, a business that Barry had funded. When this failed, Barry cut him off, and that was only a few months before the murders. Not saying here that Andrew is a suspect, then again, for all I know he is. But what I'm saying is this type of thing happened a lot and maybe someone decided to retaliate. According to Honey's sister, Mary, she believes the couple's murder could have been motivated by religion. Because the couple was strong supporters of Israel, Honey was proudly Jewish and was involved in the Jewish community, and that she would often use phrases that were not politically correct when speaking about people of a, quote, certain ethnicity. Mary also said that Honey had recently gone to a lecture, quote, about stopping money from getting into Muslim fundamentalists' hands. So when thinking about this case, I heard the question, who had the most to gain from killing them both? But what if the question is, who did they piss off enough to kill them both? When talking about suspects and theories, there are some things we need to point out. Allegedly, one theory police pursued is that someone who knew Honey very well bumped into her at the Bayview Village Mall and asked for a ride. And maybe that person even offered to drive, because the police forensic force allegedly spent a lot of time examining the driver's side of Honey's car. So, we are led to believe then that the police had thought it was possible that the person who had driven her car was the one that had attacked her. I think police also thought it was possible that the person who attacked Honey was waiting outside for her and forced her inside. I'm not sure about that because when I seen the crime scene photos of the kitchen table where her purse and bags were, I personally think if she would have been grabbed outside and forced in, then she probably would have dropped her items right where she was, just like Barry did with his phone and papers and gloves. I think it's most likely that Honey got inside the house, laid her stuff down, and then she was attacked. The fact that the killers did not take Barry's BlackBerry that he had dropped suggests that the killers were there for no other reason than to kill the Shermans, because can you imagine the corporate secrets in that phone? But the killers didn't care. Just like they didn't care about the $7,500 that was in Honey's purse, or her phone. And that's all evidence that the only thing that they wanted was the Shermans dead. This was definitely no robbery. And the Shermans' basement was 4,000 square feet, and the location of the bodies was in the most remote part of that basement. In the pool room that was rarely used, where the water was green, the cover was on, and the room hadn't even been cleaned for 3 weeks. Possibly suggesting that this area was chosen so that it would be a considerable amount of time before the bodies were discovered. Now, police have nothing to identify these individuals as they left no forensic traces behind, but they do have that grainy video of the walking man who police have labeled a suspect. Once police realized the importance of the walking man, they began a mission to figure out if anyone of about 300 people, such as associates, friends, and family of Barry and Honey, were in contact by cell phone with the walking man that night. They assumed that someone who knew the Shermans ordered this targeted help, and phone calls had bounced back and forth as part of the planning. Unfortunately, as far as we know, police were not able to link this walking man to anybody. What do I think about the walking man? I'm not sure. I think it's possible that he was somehow involved. I know I've seen the Toronto Star's Kevin Donovan's theory was that the walking man was a lookout. I've seen it said that people have said solve the puzzle of why the bodies were found like they were, and you'll solve this crime. Now, I know Jonathan was asked in his interviews about the sculptures, because allegedly the 4 children hated those sculptures. And it was put to him that the bodies were posed in eerie similarity to the sculptures. But Jonathan didn't think so. He thought it was a coincidence, and he didn't think that was any sort of theory. But according to an experienced pathologist, there was something significant about the staging. What? We don't know. But Barry's legs were crossed perfectly, and it was done deliberately. His glasses were perfectly placed on his face, which is weird, because you would imagine that if he was strangled, his glasses would have been knocked off, so obviously they were placed there after he was dead. It is believed that the belts that were used to stage the bodies and probably were used to add some shock factor when someone walked in and found them. What else the staging can possibly mean, I'm not sure. But I tend to agree with the private investigators that the staging was probably done to trick the police into believing that this crime was a murder-suicide or a double suicide, and I also tend to agree with the private investigation that the killers did this to buy themselves time. Time to get away, time to get rid of evidence, time to do who knows what else. The murders of Barry and Honey Sherman are one of the highest profile murders in recent Canadian history. Over the years, there have been many theories about what happened and who killed Barry and Honey Sherman in 2017, including suggestions that it may have been a business deal gone sideways, a hit job paid for by a big pharma rival, or a more personal matter. And while police have released several updates, including a suspect video, there have never been any charges or arrests. Among Sherman family members and friends, speculation has ranged from angry business associates of the Shermans to family to mysterious offshore assassins. Supreme Court Justice Michael Moldaver commented that, quote, "This was a very, very sophisticated crime, in my view, committed by a very sophisticated organization. At least it has those hallmarks." Police have called these murders a targeted double homicide and say that they have a theory of the case and that the estate of Barry Sherman is somehow embedded in their probe and that they have numerous persons of interest. One thing that I would like to know is why does Alexandra think Jonathan is involved? And I don't think people make those accusations all willy-nilly. There was a reason, and there was also a reason why her two other sisters agreed. Obviously, I want to know more about the investigation, but that's highly unlikely even if this does ever go to court. I would really like to know if both Barry and Honey were really the targets, or was one, for instance Honey, collateral damage. Could Honey have been the target and Barry interrupted? I don't think so, but you never know. It was such a bizarre crime, the way the bodies were staged. Were they staged like life-sized sculptures nearby? If so, what did it mean? But I think the important thing to remember is that the murder was personal. This was no robbery. Honey had money in her purse, and whoever did this wasn't after trade secrets either because Barry's phone was right there. Whoever did this wanted the Shermans dead. The question is, why? I think when you're thinking about this case, oftentimes people think who had the most to gain from the deaths. But maybe the right question is, who hated them enough to kill them both? There is no denying the lasting legacy the Shermans left behind. From Apotex to various charitable initiatives, their legacy will be long-lasting. It is said that the Shermans in their lifetime gave away well over $100 million to charity, and their daughter Alexandra has taken over the mantle of leadership of the Sherman family's charity endeavors. Quote, "With kindness and humility, my parents provided leadership and unbound generosity to charities across Canada and around the world. Their dedication to service and philanthropy impacted many people, some of whom have shared their beautiful and inspiring stories with me." The unsolved murders of Barry and Honey Sherman are still listed on the Toronto Police Service's website under current homicide investigations. If you have any information regarding this case, please contact Homicide at 416-808-7400 or at homicide@torontopolice.on.ca. Tips can also be submitted anonymously to Crime Stoppers at 416-222-TIPS or 8477 or via the internet at www.222tips.com. Now, I will be back with updates on this case, and I really do hope that the next time that you hear from me about Barry and Honey Sherman is to tell you that they have solved this case. Thank you for all the support. It really is truly appreciated. I hope you enjoyed the unsolved murders of Barry and Honey Sherman. I don't do these long ones too often because they are so time-consuming, but they are my favorite. I love a good mystery. It still blows me away that anybody would want to support Unjust Crimes. So for anybody that would like to help support the podcast, I have added a PayPal link to my YouTube page. Again, it is truly appreciated. These stories do take a lot of time to put together. You can follow Unjust Crimes on Facebook and Instagram, and I will put those links in the description of this video. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, thank you for your time and stay safe out there.